Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to the Rewley House Research Seminar Series. This is a series that was set up last year, and it's really to bring together researchers at the department, students and staff, but also out with university. And each seminar we choose a sort of concept or a word, then ask our three speakers to talk how that concept has affected their research or influenced. So often we're looking for alternative perspectives, different ideas that come into shaping multidisciplinary research, because here in the department we have a various range of DPhil and postgraduate programs, as well as a whole range of public programs as well. So we are a multidisciplinary department. We also have a whole range of research going on at the same time. So each of the seminars is aimed to take an alternative perspective on various concepts or themes. So today's theme is focusing on patterns. Advance notice for the next seminar is on decay. And we thought, well, why not? It's something different. And just an example of an alternative perspective, we have one of our lecturers talking about, from the Language Learning Centre, talking about language decay, how we forget language. Now, where was I? So I'm very glad to have three doctors here. It's Dr. Bieber, Dr. Lockhart, and Dr. Riney. David Bieber is a physicist by training. He did his DPhil here in Oxford, and he's a financial analyst now with Citibank, or with Citi, sorry, is that the correct name?
Yes, that's right.
Good. Bob Lockhart is a lecturer here in the department. He's a mathematician and a computing specialist, and he's writing a new book coming up soon called Near Doings. Is that Near Rings? Near Rings. Near Doings. Near Rings.
I'll read Near Rings.
I'll probably falter again when I try and read out your title properly. And Dr. Kevin Riney is a visiting Commonwealth Fellow. He's based at the University of West Indies in Jamaica, but he's here in the department for 3 months to carry on with some research and also to look at some best practice teaching setups. So welcome all you three, and welcome everyone here in the audience. The aim of the afternoon, apart from to discuss patterns from various perspectives, we've asked the speakers to each give a 15-minute pitch, really to throw out some ideas from their own interests in the theme of patterns. And then after each 15 minutes, there's time for a couple of questions, and then the debate really will finish at the end of all three presentations for half an hour or so. At 6 o'clock, there's a wine reception for all in the common room, and then I think for those who've booked in, there's a dinner at 6:30 here in the department as well. So without further ado, and I should say my name is David Howard, I'm the Director of Research in the department here. But I'd like to hand over now to our first guest, Dr. David Bieber. As I said, he's a financial analyst at Citi. David, a while ago, said he woke up in the middle of the night always thinking of patterns. So for a while, I'd been waiting for his latest, fashionable Icelandic knitwear, but he's still on financial markets. So over to you, David, and you'll be talking to the title of Pattern Chasing in Financial Markets, Developing Systematic Approaches to Capture Returns Efficiently. So thanks very much.
Well, thank you. It's a grand title, and it's a bit of when you
trained as a physicist, and now we have Bob Lockhart, who's a mathematician, and Bob will be looking into some of the mathematical patterns which he's carried research into. Having failed to get the title of Bob's book right on Near Rings, I will now read the title of his talk precisely. So Bob's going to be talking to the title of "It is a metatarsal chimp tent, or should it be a 10th trimest alpaca?" So having not understood really the nature of near rings, I won't even attempt to understand what the talk is going to be focusing on. But thanks very much indeed, Bob, for revealing some of your interests in patterns and how it shaped your own research interests.
Well, this is going to be in the nature of light relief, I hope. Whether it's light relief for me or you is something we might take at questions. I have been interested in various biological systems, and I was hoping there weren't any biologists in the audience I could talk about them, but I saw Jocelyn just now, so I'm already nervous. And that will come up in something of what I'm going to talk about. It won't come up in relation to chimps. First time I heard about patterns, I was very tiny, and my mother used to sit disturbingly knitting, and she said that patterns were something to do with the shapes she produced in wool. But they're also to do with the instructions she had for producing these shapes. That's how mathematicians see patterns. They see them in terms of an effect and the algorithm you use to produce that effect. But it may not be how a physicist, perhaps, and we have some physicists here, or certainly biologists might view these things, and I'll try and illustrate that. Although I won't give you any answers to this, better people than me have talked about them. This is a honeycomb. Now, mathematicians love this. It's hexagons. Hexagons are six-sided figures. In fact, even better than that, regular hexagons. They get excited about this because people write reams of stuff about tiling the plane, and there are three kinds of regular shapes that you can use to tile the plane, and the hexagon's one of them. So people have been looking at the shapes. You get these wonderful things in beehives. Joe Nicholas in our department has beehives and sells the honey. I don't think she's here, but anyway, and you wonder how they're produced. Now, people like Johannes Kepler in the 17th century looked at this and made suggestions. And one of the suggestions they made was that this shape uniquely economizes on the use of wax. And there are papers that purport to show that. And that seems to be a pretty good explanation about why this shape occurs in beehives. Except, how do we prove an assertion like that in a biological context? If it was a mathematical context, I could do a proof. Biologically, much more difficult. I don't know if you've ever heard of Darcy Thompson. I'm sure most of you have. He was a biologist at the University of St Andrews. In 1917, he wrote a classic called On Growth and Form. And one of his suggestions was that one might look to more structural explanations of shapes like this. One shouldn't rush along the evolutionary road. Now, that's not to say that the explanation I earlier advanced was not the correct one. The thing I want to ask of you, really, is how would we define correctness in these terms? What he said was that this kind of shape occurs quite naturally. Are we to suggest that soap bubbles are optimising their existence by producing nice hexagons? Well, there's the Giant's Causeway. Again, nothing to do with evolution, perhaps. So we have to be a bit more guarded when we're looking at patterns in the natural world. I suppose it comes down to the old philosophical chestnut of the problem of induction, and better people than me have given a whole range of ideas about that, everybody from David Hume to A.J. Ayer. So I certainly won't mention that today. If you want more, talk to my colleague Marion Talbot. I'm not very good at physical patterns. I just don't spot the symmetries. Maybe you do, and I've taught this stuff to students, and I notice, although I hope they haven't caught me out, they probably have, that they spot symmetries much more better than I do. But I do spot symmetries associated with sort of syntactical patterns, the symmetries associated with numbers. I think I do. So here's a pattern you might remember drearily from your childhood. Do you remember writing out the decimal expansion of a fraction? When you do this internal process of division. And there it is. You can see it there, 0.33333, a third. For mathematicians, decimals should be going on forever. So if it's 0.5, we actually think of it as 0.50000. And the thing about rational numbers is that when you have one and you do this expansion, you can prove fairly easily that you get a repetition. Maybe this is not news to any of you. So here's a seventh. 142857, 142857, 14... It's waltz time. And that signals a rational number. Now here's a number. Can anyone see how this particular pattern is produced? Take a wild guess. Oh? Yeah. This is a number. This is Champernowne's constant. Champernowne published a paper on this in the 1930s in the Bulletin of the London Math Society. It has interesting properties. For example, if you think of all the great texts that are missing in the history of humanity, for example, the Lost Library of Alexandria, well, if you were to take a text from that library and reduce it to ASCII code for each letter and each space, you would get a number that would appear in Champernowne's constant. So all human life is there. It is the difference between data and information. All possible data is in the expansion of that decimal, and it's all completely inaccessible. Champernowne was a contemporary of Alan Turing. He was at college with him. Turing was vastly impressed by Champernowne. He called him the champ, but Champernowne went to the bad. In later life, he became an economist, and he ended up as a professor of economics at Oxford and I think Cambridge. He even advised Harold Wilson, dying in the 1990s. It's funny, if you look at rational numbers and you say, okay, we understand them, they're the ones where we get this repetition of decimal expansions. then you realise very quickly that this is not a particularly great test for being rational. Champernoun's number doesn't have this repetition, so it's decidedly irrational. There are classic irrational numbers that one uses in one's mathematical life. E is one and pi is one. In the 19th century, they were proved to be not only irrational, but transcendental. But here's something you may not know. Nobody in the world knows whether e plus pi is rational or not. Nobody knows whether pi over e is rational. There are people who can recite pi to 400 places of decimals, but we don't know about patterns that might exist in the expansion of pi as a decimal. And it's a very rich area of research in number theory. To all intents and purposes, it seems to us that the expansion of pi is in some sense random. But when we come to ask what we mean by random, which is the opposite of today's seminar, the opposite of pattern, then we fall into very difficult philosophical questions of logic, which are very hard to answer. Luckily, I'm not going to attempt that today. I'm going to show you something else. You know this guy, don't you? It's the stuff of elementary maths lectures. The invention, well, first reported, as far as we know, by Leonardo of Pisa. These days it's called Fibonacci, although nobody ever called him Fibonacci in his own lifetime. That was a name given him in the 17th century by a German historian, I believe. But anyway, this is the idea. You start off with 1 and 1, and then you produce a sequence by adding the last two. 1 and 1 is 2, 1 and 2 is 3. You've all seen the Fibonacci sequence. You can produce your own Fibonacci sequence. You can go home and write down two integers and start it off. I picked 2 here. 4 and 9. So there we have 4 and 9. 4 and 9 is 13. 9 and 13 is 22. 22 and 13 and 22 is 35, and so on. Why should anybody do this? Well, there's a pattern that screams out at you. If you look not at the pattern you've produced, but the ratios, you get this. Supposing your sequence, which you'll get when you go home tonight with your calculator, is F1, F2, F3, F4, and so on. Well, look at the ratios. Look at F2 over F1 and F3 over F2, and so on. I wrote it down for my sequence, and here it is, 225, 144, 169, 159, 162. Here we go. Because the number you get gets closer and closer to this guy, and that's called the golden number. And if you have any feel for the excitement of that, why on earth should this come up? I can give you a really neat proof of that, but luckily the margins of this talk aren't big enough for me to include it. However, in questions I could show you. This number is a number that in classical times was thought to be uniquely aesthetically pleasing. A guy called Vitruvius wrote a several volume book on architecture in rather poor Latin, I understand, and he claimed that this was a number whose proportions, if used in a building, would be pleasing to people. A number of modern psychologists have done tests on this, and as far as I know, no one's ever succeeded in proving that there is any relation between this number and human sensibilities. But a guy in, I suppose, the 15th century, took up the challenge of reproducing the human form in conformance to this ratio. And there it is. And that's why it's called Vitruvian Man, the classic thing by Da Vinci. I'll finish up very quickly, because I'm not sure how I'm doing for time, by telling you about friezes. Now, first of all, I'm going to tell you what a frieze is. So here's a frieze. Rather nice, isn't it? In fact, sadly, this is not the kind of frieze I want to talk about. The kind of frieze I want to talk about is the one you might see in a bathroom somewhere. You know, these irritating long lines that repeat something over and over again. That's the kind of frieze I want, one with translational symmetry. Now, mathematicians have looked at friezes of those kind and managed to establish that, in fact, subject to that restriction of translational symmetry, there are only 7 kinds that can occur. Here's a couple of rather dressed down friezes, and I want you to look at the symmetries. This is the first frieze, so it goes on forever around your bathroom wall, and the second one's below it. Now, I'm hopeless at spotting symmetries. Maybe you're better than me. Can everybody see that there is if you put a mirror across there, there's a reflective symmetry, a horizontal reflection? Can everybody see that? Yeah. How about here? No reflective symmetry in the horizontal direction, is there? Okay. What about vertically? Well, if you put a mirror there, can you see the whole thing reflects on itself and there's a vertical symmetry? Is that okay? What about this one? I'll leave it to you. Is there a vertical reflective symmetry? There is, isn't there? A few more. If you put a point there, you can revolve. There's a rotational symmetry. Okay? What about this one? Any rotational symmetries? oh dear, this is where I get lost. I think there is, isn't there? Yeah, there is a rotational symmetry. So, but you appreciate the horizontal reflective symmetry was not there in the second one. Now, the game when classifying friezes, and I promise you know about as much about them as I do by the end of this talk, is to look for those symmetries. But there's a further symmetry, one that you may not be so familiar with. In both of these cases, if you put a mirror across the middle, a horizontal mirror, and reflect, and then displace, then you do get another symmetry of the frieze. This is a so-called glide symmetry. Can everybody see that? See, I'd have to work in it. You're obviously better than me. So you reflect and then move along, and that would go to there. Okay? Bonk along. That's a glide symmetry. So with these possible symmetries, you can classify any kind of frieze that can occur. How am I doing for time?
You'll have about a minute to go.
Okay, so let's look at how a normal person walks. So I'm going to use me as an exemplar of this. So you walk like this, don't you? Now imagine your footprints. That will produce a frieze. Would there be a horizontal reflective symmetry in that? There would not, would there? Because like Mr. Spigot, you've got nothing against either leg. Okay? Would there be a rotational symmetry in your footprints? Again, no, because when you rotate, your feet apart and move in the other direction. No rotational one. What about a vertical symmetry? No, of course not, again, for the same reason. Would there be a glide reflective symmetry? Yes, there would. So a normal person, and in summertime in Oxford, you can see normal people in Corn Market, they will walk like that, and there'll be only one symmetry, a glide. Now, what about an Oxford academic walking? They might probably walk more like that. Now, what are the symmetries that would be involved in their footprints? Well, of course, you get the glide again, but you get a horizontal symmetry. Here is a catalogue of all the possible symmetries associated with friezes, and you'll find the Oxford academic occurring there, and the normal person there. And I've produced some papers which give you all possible symmetries of friezes. You might like to take one. So thank you very much for coming, and I'll hand on to the next speaker. Oh, there may be some questions.
Are there any questions for Bob? Because I mean, physics has been defined probably incorrectly as applied mathematics. So I think maybe in the questions afterwards, it'd be interesting to see whether in David's work he's looking at this type of symmetry or maths or numbers or not. Because I'm going back to my school days to try and follow some of the maths and physics. But we'll move on to. Are there any questions for Bob? We'll follow up in the second half. In the questions overall, and link the two papers together, or three papers. And it's a great pleasure now to welcome Dr. Kevin Reining. As I said, mentioned, Kevin's at University of West Indies in Jamaica at the Mona campus, and he's a visiting Commonwealth Fellow. And it's the last time I'll tell this story, but when Kevin and I were talking about the Commonwealth Fellowship, we're both looking at one of the sections that said, scholars will have a warm clothing allowance. We both scoffed at this sort of neo-colonial sort of notion of the tropics, etc. Well, Kevin arrived from Jamaica about 2 weeks ago in the middle of a blizzard. The first thing we thought about was going to the warm weather clothing allowance. So I'm very glad you're here with us for this term. His research is on sustainable development, and he's been looking very closely at the links between climate change and food security, particularly in the Caribbean. So I know that's you're currently doing research on this area, and today you'll be talking to the title of Climate Change, Agriculture and Food Insecurity in the Caribbean with insights from Jamaica.
Thank you, David. So this is a completely different type of presentation, but I think it's very much relevant because when I think about patterns, the changes in the climate is very much important to many different states in the Caribbean, and it's the changes over time that we use to project what the climate might look like in the future, and this will have serious implications for people's livelihoods. And so I thought it was very much fitting to present this work. And of course, when Liz asked me to present the talk, I was also in the frame of mind of thinking about the change in climate that I'll go through a couple months after. And so it was very much linked to this whole idea of talking about climate change and its impact on our food security. first of all, the Caribbean is considered to be a hotspot when it comes down to climate change. When you look at IPCC reports, the Caribbean, even though it contributes a small percentage to the global greenhouse gas emissions, we are expected to be one of the first and most severely impacted by climate change. And so when you talk about our development challenges, the whole issue of climate change is very much important as it relates to the way forward. And when you think about the regional characteristics in terms of our small sizes, the fact that most of our towns are located along the coast, and also the fragile nature of our economies, all of this plays into our vulnerability to these global environmental changes that are expected to come alongside global economic change. And so the whole issue of double exposure is very important to us, because it's not just about climate change. It's also about the instability in the global economy. And when you think about the fact that by the next few decades from now, we'll have 9 billion people living on the planet. 9 billion people that will be demanding more energy, demanding more food. All of that trickles down to what happens in the local economy. And so even though I'm looking at Jamaica, it does relate back to the larger picture as well. And agriculture is particularly at risk because, especially in the Caribbean, we depend a lot on natural elements. It's not as high-tech as you'll find in the developed world. And so the amount of rainfall and also the seasonal distribution of rainfall is particularly important to the livelihoods of many persons throughout the Caribbean. And so there needs to be some urgent steps to assess the potential impacts and build local and regional adaptive capacity to some of these changes that are expected to come. And in terms of Jamaica, agriculture, even though it contributes just 6% to our GDP, it's very important because it is a major source of livelihood for many persons. And persons also rely on the agricultural industry for subsistence purposes as well. So if you think about the fact that you might have close to 300,000 small farmers in Jamaica out of a population of roughly 2.7, 2.8 million people, agriculture is a very important sector. And it faces a variety of internal and external threats. And when you think about the internal threats, we have, for instance, an aging farming population. The average age is over 56 in terms of the average farmer in Jamaica. Most young people are trying to get out of agriculture because it's not as glamorous as other sectors. So it's very difficult. I remember speaking to one farmer in the field, and he said to me, it's better to probably play a lotto, which is the lottery game, than to bank your money on farming. And so it's a big issue. High investment, low returns, many times. And so, when you think about those internal issues in terms of the demographics, the fact that we have very weak infrastructure, both in terms of transportation, marketing, very poor extension services, these all play into the sort of vulnerability that you'll find in Jamaica, and it's quite indicative of many other small island states throughout the world. And added to that is, of course, the external factors, a lot of which we have no control over. But at the same time, they do play a very significant role when it comes on to how we'll be able to adapt in terms of future changes. And all these changes, of course, will be compounded, all these threats will be compounded by climate change. And so it's hard for you to discuss food insecurity in the Caribbean without not looking at climate change. And this is something that we're feeling. And I know there are a number of debates out there over whether or not climate change is real. But based on what we've seen in the Caribbean, whether or not it's climate change or climate variability, we have seen changes. And this is just an example of how vulnerable the agricultural sector is to extreme weather events. Before the 1990s, Jamaica had had been impacted by just around 3 hurricanes between 1950 and the start of the 1990s. Since the 1990s, we've seen a significant increase in the number of storms and hurricanes. We almost expect to be impacted by a hurricane or at least a storm or a drought event every single year. And so this is affecting us significantly. It has resulted in millions of dollars in damages to the agricultural sector, and it is a major issue when it comes on to trying to secure people's livelihoods. So what I'm going to present on briefly is this project that we've started, funded by the USAID, and we've been doing this since July of last year, and it's an 18-month project, and it's part of the Jamaica REACH program, which is aimed at streamlining climate change in the developmental objectives of Jamaica. And I like this particular project because it forces us, or it enables us to work alongside policy experts and the technocrats. And it's not just doing research for getting publication's sake, but it's real work with getting into the field with the farmers, spending a significant chunk of time finding out what their challenges are, and trying to come up with this framework in terms of assessing vulnerability in a very integrated, multidisciplinary way. And so the core project activities involve an IVA, which is an Integrated Vulnerability Assessment Household Survey. We do some crop modeling as well, and I'll explain that a little later. And some knowledge, attitude, and perception surveys with local farmers in terms of how they perceive climate change, but speaking in very simple terms so that they can understand what we're talking about. And trying to come up with climate risk profiles for the different communities. Because one of the things that we realize is that vulnerability is not homogeneous. It is very much different for different communities. And even as small as Jamaica is, there are several different agroecological zones. And so for you to tackle climate change and food security issues, the policies have to be robust. The policies have to be able to take those differences into consideration instead of a one-size-fits-all approach. And so what we did was to look at 4 farming communities located in distinct agroecological zones. And so this is just giving you an idea as to how different the sort of environments are. So this is southern St. Elizabeth. And St. Elizabeth is the food basket of Jamaica, even though it receives the lowest annual rainfall. The farmers have managed to adapt significantly to that type of weather pattern that they've been used to over the years through a series of different methods like mulching, which is very, very unique, not just to Jamaica, but to the Caribbean, and also I think in certain parts of Africa as well, where farmers will lay certain layers of grass on the surface of the soil to keep it cool, to reduce evapotranspiration. So this is a way in which they've adapted to that sort of climate. And so within just a couple miles away from St. Elizabeth, you can see a totally different type of climate as well. And so the sort of challenges that the farmers will face here will be totally different from the sort of challenges that the farmers will face in southern St. Elizabeth. So this is one of our community, Hounslow. And then we have Christiana, Douglas Castle. And here, which is along the Blue Mountains, which is famous for coffee, we have Spring Hill, which is very wet compared to all the other communities. So it's communities spread across 4 distinct agroecological zones to get a kind of snapshot in terms of what is going on in those particular farming communities. And so this is a rough idea of the model. It involves, and of course I need to point out that this was a collaborative effort, it is a collaborative effort, not just by the department, but we've partnered with the International Center for Tropical Agriculture, which is part of the CGIAR group based in Colombia. And basically most of the downscaling is done there. And before this, most of the projections that we used to have were very rough. You couldn't apply it to an island scale. And so it had to be downscaled for us to use it in the crop suitability models. What we do for the crop modeling is to take that data using a mechanistic model. In this case, we use EcoCrop. and we looked at how those changes will affect the growing parameters for specific crops. So by looking at IPC scenarios, we stuck to the business as usual scenario in this case. And we looked at how changes in terms of temperature and precipitation in general. There are a variety of different biophysical variables in terms of evapotranspiration, humidity, minimum, maximum temperature, minimum, maximum rainfall, all of those different variables. We plugged those into the model, and then we looked at agronomic data that we had in terms of, each crop requires a certain level of temperature and rainfall to produce maximum yields, for instance. So if there's a change in terms of that particular range, then it will affect the performance of that particular crop. So we were able to use a suitability index to show which crops would be affected more by these changes. And then alongside that, we were able to do our vulnerability assessments in the community. It was very participatory, of course, in terms of going into the communities and finding out from the farmers themselves what were some of the impacts they were facing. And we used basically all those three information in terms of the climate data, the crop modeling data, and the vulnerability assessments to come up with an idea in terms of how vulnerable each community would be. So just to browse quickly into the preliminary findings. So far, we've almost completed the project in terms of the data collection phase for at least 3 of the major components. And preliminary analysis has revealed several important findings as it relates to exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity in the 4 communities. But for today's presentation, I just want to focus on farmers' biophysical exposure and sensitivity. And of course, even though I'm focusing on this, we are very much cognizant of the fact that these challenges and vulnerabilities are mediated by a range of different socioeconomic realities. I'm going to talk about realities. A major challenge, for instance, that we have to deal with in Jamaica is its bad governance. And as a good example of this, we're still trying to negotiate the IMF loan agreement. And in the heights of that, the government took 60 million Jamaican dollars to buy SUVs for politicians while we were trying to negotiate with the IMF in terms of trying to secure a loan agreement. So when you talk about misallocation of funds, we're doing the work at the ground level, but there are a number of other things that happens at the policy level that is very much significant to what we're doing here. And so even though we're doing all of this research, one of the biggest challenges that we have is trying to convince politicians that what we're doing actually is important. And so that's a totally different part of it in terms of the problem that we're faced with. The methodology is a very, as I said, participatory type approach in terms of we try to incorporate the communities community members as much as possible. For this phase, we did a survey of 231 farmers, which was basically a 10% sample of each community. And here you'll see a breakdown in terms of the different agroecological zones for each community. In terms of the climate data, we're expecting to see an increase by about 1.1 degrees Celsius by 2030 and 1.7 degrees Celsius by 2050. So we're expecting to see an increase in temperature and a slight decline in precipitation. And interestingly, we're expecting to see a geographical shift in terms of suitability for specific crops towards higher altitudes. And we also found small farmers and female-headed households highly vulnerable. But at the same time, we saw varied geographies in terms of vulnerability. And so this is just showing you some of the changes that we expect in terms of maximum temperature for 2050. You can see that there is a slight change as you move forward compared to 2030 and the current projections. The very interesting thing with this work is that the findings at the community levels more or less confirmed some of the projections that we made. For instance, farmers in the communities themselves identified that they have seen a decline in rainfall over the last few decades. So this is very important, and of course we're hoping to get some publications with these because it is showing you where the local knowledge is actually supporting the scientific knowledge, and I think that's very, very important. We looked at responses to rainfall changes. The sad reality is that most of the farmers, even though they identified changes, they weren't responding. So even though they realized that there was a change, you're not seeing that, adaptation to these changes as it relates to rainfall. The same thing with drought. Interestingly, Hounslow stands out here because, as I said before, it's located in southern St. Elizabeth, and so you find that they are particularly vulnerable to changes in terms of distribution of rainfall. And so you can see where they stand out compared to all the other communities. While in the case of Spring Hill, which is already in a very wet zone, even though they've seen changes in terms of drought impacts, they have not been impacted as much as the other communities. In terms of adaptation strategies, there are a range of adaptation strategies for drought, which is very interesting, which reveals that there is still some gap in terms of what some of the farmers were saying as it relates to rainfall. But I think the big difference is that with drought, which is a way more extreme change, farmers have over time, and a change that has been happening for a longer period, farmers have adapted, but mostly within St. Elizabeth compared to the other communities. So one of the things that's coming out from the research is that maybe, for instance, farmers located elsewhere in other parts of the country could actually learn from some of the adaptive strategies that the farmers in parts of St. Elizabeth have actually employed. But there needs to be some form of sharing of information between these groups, which is really left to the responsibility of the Ministry of Agriculture. Last, in terms of the future vulnerabilities, so the crop models basically showed that there will be significant changes over time. And of course, these crops that we've basically flagged are the ones that are expected to see significant changes over time in terms of suitability. And all of these crops are very important to Jamaica, of course, in terms of domestic consumption. So any significant change in the performance of these crops will have a significant implication for food security. And this is just to show you one of the examples in terms of the Irish potato, in terms of current data, and also in terms of the expected changes by 2050. Basically next steps is to further the research. What we've been doing in terms of crop modeling is really just the first step because it's very mechanistic. So we have to do a number of different trials. So we're going to do some more plant varietal work to look at different cultivars, for instance with Irish potato, to see which cultivars might be best suited for specific local conditions. And so basically the work has just begun in that regard.
Great, thank you very much indeed. We'll ask the three speakers to come and sit at the front in a second, but are there any immediate questions to Kevin concerning his research on food insecurities?
What's the reason that people are unwilling to change to new crops? Is it to do with a lack of confidence in changing to another product, or is it more economic, that the retooling with different machinery? Is that more relevant?
But I do think that part of the reason for resisting change is linked to culture, where a lot of these farmers, they've decided to invest in particular crops because they've seen their forefathers. That's what they've been used to. And a very interesting thing in Jamaica as well too is a lack of information. I remember when we were struggling to keep the banana industry, the export sector, when we were under threat with the World Trade Organization, and we thought that if we lost the UK market in terms of banana, it would wipe out the entire industry. That's for Jamaica. When they actually did it, they finally realized that there was a big domestic market for banana in Jamaica. And so now they're producing even more than just bananas, but we've gone into value-added stuff. We have banana powder and a whole heap of different types of, added value products. So that's the other challenge as well, lack of information. And I don't think we have much information when it comes on to plant genotypic data in terms of which cultivars are the best suited for our local climate.
Okay, well, yeah, there's two questions. That'd be great. So would you, and then
Yeah, I noticed on one of your slides you said that the volatility in climate is affecting the smaller farmers and the households headed by women more than others. Is part of the strategy then to persuade some people to give up their holdings and to amalgamate into bigger units? Is that one of the consequences that could be planned, or is it an accident? It just happens?
No, that is one of our concerns. Clearly, the major reason why small farmers are vulnerable is because of the limited capital that they have. The sad thing is that there hasn't been a culture of cooperative or group farming in Jamaica. So when you compare it with Latin America, where you can have an entire cooperative having 3,000, 4,000 members, the average cooperative in Jamaica would be 12. And there's a strong issue with trust. I've seen several times when the government have intervened and they've forced farmers to come together, and within 2 weeks the cooperative, falls apart, and then it reforms itself, but with a very small group of persons who trust themselves, trust each other. And it's not also surprising to see a pastor or some religious person involved in a group. I think the trust network issue is a major issue as well. But if we are to move forward, yeah, I do think group farming is the way to go. But there will be a lot of, training and educating farmers in terms of the benefits for group farming as opposed to farming on their own. And while we are very much sensitive to gender issues, I still think we have a far way to go in Jamaica in terms of, creating more gender-sensitive policies and understanding the differences in terms of the challenges that men face compared to women. And so when I say gender, I'm not just saying women, but we also need to understand that there are certain gender roles. And so a female farmer usually is a single mother. And so she has to be juggling household duties alongside farming duties. And so the challenges that she faces is way different from the challenges that a male farmer would face.